So the focus of this discussion now is about the learning and data on learning. That doesn't mean to say that all the other data we need, the administrative, the financial, the customer focus data, is not important. It clearly is. But I think we can reasonably argue that if the National Plan for Music Education is about the education of all people, the focus, the most important part of our data, should be that data on the musical progress of our young people. So if we've got to focus on data about learning, what are we really looking for? I think there's three broad questions that we need to ask ourselves. And the first is, maybe fairly obvious really, but is the data we are capturing reflecting the learning we want the young people to acquire? What we really need is that at the heart of our data is a reflection of a model of learning that we use with all young people across the Music Hub. As I said, this is fairly obvious in one sense, but we do need to make sure that the data we're capturing reflects the learning we think that the young people need to be developing and the kind of musical learning that the young people are saying they want to develop for themselves. In a slightly different context, therefore, if you think about the debate around the EBAC data is secure. We know that that's all fine. The questions that were being raised by many people was not about the data itself, but the fact that that data wasn't really reflecting the breadth of learning that many people felt that children should be acquiring. So actually that data they felt wasn't appropriate. In a more obvious musical context, having data on how many of your participants in a community folk group have grade 5 theory may not be too useful to you when you're thinking that actually the most important thing about the learning for this group is how to develop orally an arrangement of a folk tune for a mixed group of instruments. The data on grade 5 theory held by your participants isn't going to help you much in that context. So first thing to do really is to check, is the data we're capturing reflecting the learning we want our young people to develop? For those hubs and music services who run their own certification and assessment systems, this probably isn't going to be too much of an issue. Here at Hampshire, we have a model of learning that we expect our staff to use. Therefore, we can anticipate the teaching will reflect that model of learning, and all our assessments, our stage certificates, are based on that learning as well. So we can be reasonably secure that the data we have does reflect the learning we're trying to develop. But what happens if you're using one of the commercial graded examination systems? Can we be so secure about the learning there? So the first thing to check is, do the criteria that lead to the assessments and the grade exam outcomes reflect the learning? Critically, do staff know what the learning underpinning that criteria really is? Now, the graded exams publish on their websites the criteria, so do staff actually know what those learning criteria are so that we can be confident that the data that comes out of their examination systems actually reflects that learning? Perhaps even more important, do the students know what the learning is? Or do they just know they've got to do their two pieces in their scales? That's a fairly simplistic idea, and I'm quite sure many teachers will be going beyond that. But it's still really important to make sure that the students are clear about their learning. And ultimately, of course, as a music service or as a hub leader, we need to make sure that the teaching that the staff are delivering for their young people reflects that learning too. So we have to make sure that the strategies that we think will lead to the development of the learning, that leads to the appropriate development in the grades, is really effective. So it's that professional development programme with staff to make sure that the learning that comes out of their teaching is as effective as it can be. So one last point to consider about this data. It really should be consistent, and therefore the learning should be consistent across all the provision that we make. So this is for classroom music, it is for small group instrumental learning, even for our ensembles. Many of you will be familiar with the most recent of the Ofsted documentation, the professional development materials, which give guidance, in this case, on promoting good practice. What this says very clearly on the front page is, the principles and key questions contained in this guidance are applicable to all forms of music teaching and learning, in the classroom, in additional instrumental and vocal tuition, in ensemble work, and in project work led by music professionals and animateurs. From a data point of view, this is obviously helpful because there's consistency across all our provision and we can start to make comparisons. It's that benchmarking idea. So actually, are they making more progress in their ensemble learning than they are in their residencies and workshops or the small group instrumental tuition? But I go back again to the students. What's even more important is they have consistency in their learning. If they're learning in all these three different contexts, and more probably, they need to be clear about what their learning is and how they're progressing in it. And if we can have a consistent approach across all those areas, it can only benefit.